To some, he was the steadfast defender of liberty against tyranny. To others, he was an opportunist dedicated to nothing but his own advancement. But no one can plausibly deny the impact he has had on language, oratory, politics and philosophy in the 2,000 years since his death. Living as he did during a time crowded with exalted figures, Caesar, Crassus, Pompey, nonetheless he holds his own as one of the most remarkable Romans of the Republican era and beyond. In this video, we will explore the often turbulent life and enduring legacy of the Roman statesman Cicero. Marcus Tullius Cicero was born on the 3rd of January in the year 106 BC in Arpinum, which is in central Italy. His family, though quite wealthy, were not especially well connected, meaning that Cicero would have to rely on his talent and force of will if he wanted to go far in public life. At this point in time, Rome was a republic and had been for hundreds of years, ever since the tyrannical and fabulously named Tarquinius Superbus had been deposed in 509 BC. The Romans very much saw the fall of the oppressive kings as their liberation from bondage, and although the Romans were of course more than happy to enslave others, that concept of liberty would form the bedrock of their constitution, namely that no one man could hold all the power. That was what kings did, and the Romans did not like kings. Like most constitutions, however, by Cicero's time this rule had been relaxed ever so slightly. In fact, there had been rare instances where it was decided that Rome was in such dire straits that it was prudent to appoint a single person as ruler. But this was very much an in extremis scenario, in theory anyway. As he embarked on his studies, the young Cicero began to show particular interest in, as well as aptitude for, oratory, rhetoric and philosophy, which were all very much seen as Greek disciplines. At the time, well-to-do Romans were expected to be well-versed in these Greek disciplines, in the same way that well-to-do Europeans were expected to have a strong grounding in Latin and the classics many centuries later. These early passions would remain with Cicero for his entire life, though at the time they earned him the nickname the Greek, which was not meant as a compliment. If you wanted to achieve high office in the Roman Republic, as the ambitious Cicero definitely did, you'd have to climb what was known as the cursus honorum, the course of honours, starting with the office of quaestor, which would gain you admittance into the Senate. You couldn't be appointed to high office unless you'd served in the offices below. For example, if you wanted to be elected consul, which was the top job, the crowning achievement of any political career, you had to first be elected praetor, and you had to have served as quaestor before being elected to praetor. There was an additional office, that of aedile, which wasn't essential on the cursus honorum. Cicero was elected aedile, but you could go from quaestor to praetor without having served it. Each office was also age restricted, meaning that you would have to have at least some life experience. The good news was that, much like the British House of Lords, once you'd been admitted to the Senate, that was essentially you for life, unless you did something really bad to offend the censors. By our period, it's important to note, they really were beginning to play fast and loose with a lot of these rules. Unfortunately for Cicero, it was expected that those seeking high office would have at least some experience of military service. So, in 90 to 88 BC, a reluctant Cicero took himself off to perform the bare minimum military campaigning as he served in the Social War. Famously, if not notoriously squeamish, he would become well known for his aversion to the gladiatorial games. It's interesting to see how far he was willing to leave the comfort of his libraries in order to advance his career. Once returned from campaign, Cicero studied law under Scaevola, a very well-respected, though now retired, Roman lawyer. He began his legal practice roughly between 83 and 81 BC, and while most records of his early cases have been lost, one surviving case is very interesting. At the time, Rome was under the dictatorship of Sulla, who was notoriously ruthless towards his enemies, and a man called Roscius had been accused of murdering his father. Now, taking on the defence of an accused patricide was a risk in itself for a young lawyer of no particular family. But Cicero would go on to accuse cronies of Sulla of having committed the murder instead of Roscius, and thus he risked incurring the wrath of the dictator himself. In the year 79 BC, Cicero, having worked himself into a state of exhaustion, left Italy for Greece to further hone his skills as a statesman. Now, Plutarch, one of Cicero's first biographers, suggested that the real reason Cicero departed Rome in 79 was because he was afraid of retribution from Sulla. Of course, we'll never know if this is true or not, but we'll see later that Cicero did have a habit of quietly taking himself elsewhere when things were heating up for him in Rome. The Greek tour is one of the most significant periods of Cicero's life. It was on this tour that he really perfected the arts for which he would later become so well regarded. He read philosophy at the Athenian Academy of Plato. He then travelled to Rhodes, where he was instructed in rhetoric and oratory by the great Apollonius Molon, who famously declared that there are 3 components to rhetoric: delivery, delivery, and delivery. Before returning to Rome, like all tourists to Greece before and since, he consulted the oracle at Delphi, who, according to Plutarch, told him to make his own genius and not the opinion of the people the guide of his life. Upon his return to Rome, the Greek training seems to have done the trick. In the year 75 BC, Cicero was appointed quaestor, first step on the cursus honorum, if you recall. He was sent to Sicily to help in the governance of that province, and while there, believe it or not, he stumbled across the lost tomb of Archimedes of Eureka fame. He also seems to have gained an excellent reputation among the Sicilians. He'd been assigned to Sicily in the midst of a grain shortage and handled it well and fairly. In fact, there's a brilliant story where Cicero was returning to Rome from Syracuse and he spots one of his friends in Campania, and fully expecting to have been the talk of the town in his absence, he asks this chap how well his epoch-shifting governance has been received back in Rome, and the chap looks at him surprised and replies, "Oh, you've been away, have you? Where have you been?" It was also around this time that Cicero married Terentia. Though the match was probably made so that Cicero would have enough money to enter the Senate, Terentia came from a very old patrician family. The two seem to have got on rather well. Terentia, described by Plutarch as neither meek nor mild, was the mother of Cicero's 2 children, Tullia and Marcus. The Sicilians appreciated what Cicero had achieved at any rate, and in 70 BC, when they were looking for an advocate to represent them a few years later in a case they wanted to bring against a particularly nasty and corrupt governor named Verres, it was to Cicero they turned. Having been a senator for several years at this point, upon the completion of his quaestorship, Cicero was widely regarded as the second best advocate in Rome, and the best, a man named Hortensius, would be defending Verres. Whilst it's certainly true that the scale of Verres' corruption was so great that finding evidence for his prosecution was no great task, it should be remembered that Verres and Hortensius were both very well connected men, and Hortensius in particular came from a very old patrician family, whereas Cicero was a novus homo, a new man, and he was defending a group of provincials, none of whom had any great connections in Rome, and connections mattered to Roman juries. In order to win, Cicero would have to rely on everything he had been taught about how to influence an audience, how to state a point in such a way, how to get a crowd to feel what emotion he wanted it to feel. And he did it. In fact, by the time Cicero had finished with him, Verres had no choice but to flee Italy, and Cicero was now regarded as the best advocate in Rome. To no one's surprise, this new man received the highest number of votes in the praetorial election in 67 BC. In the Senate, there were 2 main factions, the patricians and the populists. The patrician benches were made up of men from old Roman families, men who could point to dozens of consuls in their family tree. You'll see this group referred to as the Optimates, that was the name of their party. These men were traditionalists and very much supported the Roman constitution and that notion of liberty. The other major faction was the Populists, or the Populares. Now, the Populists were keen to buck the status quo and to make reforms to the law that would benefit the poor. Now, as laudable as this sounds, the way they went about it was rather suspect. In fact, Plutarch described them as operating not from the best motives but for their own gain. Rabble-rousing, you might say. And we'll see just how valuable a mob of supporters could be in Rome when we meet Catiline and Clodius shortly. Cicero, as a new man, often found himself treading a precarious path between the two groups, particularly towards the end of his career. At heart, he was a constitutionalist, and so politically felt most at home with the patricians. But due to that lack of an ancient family, he was never quite allowed in. He was always an outsider, despite the fact that he exuded the talents that were so highly prized among the patricians. Therefore, there were times when, in order to advance his career, he had to throw his lot in with someone more powerful, but with whom he wasn't so ideologically aligned. A good example of this was in 67 BC, when Cicero publicly backed Pompey the Great, a general whose lust for power could only be rivalled by that of Caesar's. When Pompey requested leave from the Senate to see off an attack by pirates, which he claimed posed a great danger to Rome, he asked to be given a great deal of power to act with a consular level of imperium, despite Pompey not even being a senator at the time. Whatever his private thoughts of the power grab, Cicero bit his tongue and went along with the powerful general. By 64 BC, Cicero, now 42 years old, had set his sights on the consulship, the very top job in Republican Rome, if you recall. It would not be an easy ride for him. By this time, many of his supporters among the patricians had become unimpressed with his closeness to Pompey the Great. And, as we've discussed, they were only too happy to believe the worst of this upstart Cicero. However, unfortunately for the patricians, Cicero wasn't the only undesirable candidate standing for the consulship. A former favourite of the dictator Sulla, and by all accounts a brutal and violent man by the name of Sergius Catiline, had also announced his candidacy. Catiline had previously been tried for extortion during his governorship of Africa, but had been cleared. Interestingly, Cicero had originally agreed to defend him against the charge, but for unknown reasons pulled out. At any rate, the hostility between the men further deepened when, upon discovering that two of the most powerful men in Rome, Marcus Crassus and Julius Caesar, had invested great sums of money in bribing voters on Catiline's behalf, Cicero responded to this by making his In Toga Candida oration decrying Catiline and his corruption on the day of the consular election. Now, as things stood, Catiline, who had agreed a joint campaign with another candidate, Antonius Hybrida, had a good chance of winning the consulship, and, having heard the rumours that Catiline was planning essentially to ride roughshod over that Roman constitution, the patrician faction decided to hold their nose and endorse Cicero. And so, against all odds, Cicero achieved his life ambition. A novus homo, he had become the first consul in his family. He shared the consulship with Antonius Hybrida, the weak-willed and sottish man who had run alongside Catiline, and whom Cicero was easily able to bribe into compliance. Cicero's first hurdle as consul came in the form of an agrarian bill, which would appoint 10 commissioners to distribute land to settlers. The problem was that the bill proposed equipping commissioners with the power to raise armies to buy and sell public land, as well as numerous other privileges. A power grab, in short, or that's certainly how it was interpreted at the time. Meanwhile, Catiline had been recruiting a power base. Sallust, who was a contemporary historian, describes these as all who were in disgrace or afflicted by poverty or consciousness of guilt, namely discontented senators, the heavily indebted, opportunist thugs, and most worryingly for Cicero, many of Sulla's old soldiers. This last contingent, who were mainly based in Etruria outside Rome, were particularly keen for violence and the opportunity to plunder, one presumes. Their impatience was compounded by the fact that Pompey and his army were due to return to the city, and the conspirators wanted to get in first. However, Catiline still wanted the consulship and was still willing to get it by legitimate means. But Cicero, who had spies in Catiline's camp and who suspected Catiline of having been behind a recent plot to kill him, was determined that Catiline should get nowhere near the consulship. On the day of the consular elections, Cicero very publicly wore a breastplate while presiding to emphasise the danger he believed himself to be in. Catiline lost the election, but if Cicero thought that was the end of Catiline, he was very wrong. Shortly after the election, Cicero received an unexpected visitor, Crassus. Now, you'll recall that it was Crassus, along with Caesar, who had bankrolled the bribes on Catiline's previous shot at the consulship. So you can imagine Cicero's shock and suspicion when his old enemy turned up at his home. The information Crassus gave Cicero was this. He, Crassus, had received an anonymous letter which advised that Catiline and the conspirators were plotting to put Cicero to death along with a number of other prominent figures. Unfortunately, though Catiline was named in the letter, they were not seen as sufficient proof that there was a conspiracy. More bad news was just around the corner when the Senate learned that a centurion named Manlius, a supporter of Catiline, was massing an army with the intention of marching on Rome. At this news, Cicero had no difficulty in passing a senatus consultum ultimum, martial law in effect. Things were brought to a head on the 7th of November when a fresh attempt was made on Cicero's life. Luckily for him, however, he was forewarned of the plot by Fulvia, a patrician woman whose lover Curio was in Catiline's inner circle. Cicero summoned an emergency meeting of the Senate to discuss what ought to be done about the persistent threat of the conspirators, when, to everyone's amazement, Catiline himself turned up. Shocked at the pure gall of the man, Cicero gave what is widely regarded as one of his best orations. "When, O Catiline, do you mean to cease abusing our patience? How long is that madness of yours to mock us? When is there to be an end of that unbridled audacity of yours, swaggering about as it does now?" This invective continued, and Catiline fled the city and joined Manlius in the field. But neither Cicero nor the city was out of danger yet. Catiline might be gone, but he had supporters, powerful supporters, still in Rome. How to root them out? Well, as it happened, luck was on Cicero's side at last. Lentulus Sura, Catiline's lieutenant, was still in the city plotting the insurrection with the rest of the conspirators there. In doing this, they enlisted the help of the Allobroges, a warlike Gallic tribe who were unhappy with their treatment by the Romans, and who, according to Sallust, were in a great deal of debt. But, unhappily for Sura, the Allobroges decided the whole thing was not worth the risk, and informed Cicero of the conspirators' plot. Cicero then persuaded the Allobroges to turn spy for him and give him a list of the conspirators. Lentulus Sura, Cethegus, Statilius, Gabinius, and Caeparius were all seized on the charge of treason. Cicero had his men, but what to do with them? Now, at the very end of his consulship, he summoned a meeting of the Senate to help him decide what to do with the traitors. To begin with, the speakers all supported the death penalty without trial, but once the more senior speakers had had their say, Caesar, who had by this point been elected Pontifex Maximus, or chief priest, and whom many actually suspected of having been involved in the plot, spoke in favour of seizing the assets of the accused and having them banished from Rome instead. Now, Caesar put his argument across very eloquently and might have won the day if it hadn't been for an impassioned speech by Cato the Younger, who was a patriot to his core. Fanatically so, you might say. The problem that seems to have vexed the Senate was that the conspirators hadn't actually carried out the crimes they were plotting, and to this Cato accused them of being too soft on the traitors, and if they were all to wait around to be murdered, then of course no justice could be done. And so the 5 conspirators were taken from the Senate to the carcer, where they were duly executed, and Cicero was hailed as Pater Patriae, father of his country, for putting down the Catilinarian conspiracy, as, on learning of the deaths of their co-conspirators, much of Catiline's army deserted him, and he didn't long outlive the news, as he died in battle shortly after. Having served in the top role, and in the eyes of so many, himself not the least, saved the Republic from insurrection and collapse, Cicero's term in office came to an end. To some, however, the way he'd handled the fates of the conspirators left a bitter taste. He had, after all, sentenced 5 Roman citizens to death without trial, and some even began to question whether the threat posed by the conspirators had not been exaggerated by Cicero to bolster his own glory. The whole affair would prove to have far-reaching consequences for him. In fairness to Cicero, it was an unenviable position. Had he not put the conspirators to death, instead favouring Caesar's suggestion of banishment, who's to say they wouldn't have continued to plot their insurrection? Also, Romans didn't have such a thing as a custodial sentence. Locking someone up and throwing away the key was an alien concept to them. There were, of course, prisons, but these were places where accused persons were housed until it had been decided what to do with them. Perhaps if lifelong incarceration had been an option, it would have solved a problem, but then, as with banishment, what was to stop a subsequent Senate, a Senate sympathetic to Catiline, passing legislation to have the men released? And, at risk of justifying ends by means, the execution of the 5 proved to be the death knell of Catiline's conspiracy. The years following Cicero's consulship were marked by some of the most politically important events of the Republican era. We've already met Pompey, Crassus and Caesar. We've established they were 3 of the most power-hungry men, arguably in European history. And to understand Cicero's downfall, as well as the downfall of the Roman Republic itself, we need to go into a bit more detail. Pompey and Crassus, both military men, hated each other. They were bitter rivals, and Crassus held a lot of resentment for Pompey, who had taken most of the credit for putting down the Spartacus revolt, which had been mainly down to the utter savagery of Crassus and his forces. And while there certainly wasn't the same level of hatred, both men were deeply suspicious of Caesar. However, the 3 men quickly realised that if they were to get any of their ambitious bills past the Senate, they would need to work together. You'll remember that pestilential Roman constitution forbidding men from holding too much power. And so they joined forces in what history calls the First Triumvirate, rule of 3 men, where each would use his considerable influence to promote the interests of the other 2. In this way, Pompey was able to get land for his veterans, Crassus was awarded tax reductions for his equestrian clients, Caesar was awarded governorship of more than 1 province at a time, and so on and so on. How does this affect Cicero, I hear you ask? Well, that came about in quite a daft way. Almost a year after his consulship had ended, a young patrician friend of Cicero's, named Clodius, created a scandal. It was the night of the rites of the good goddess, and this was an occasion which was strictly for women only. No men were allowed, not even the chief priest, and it was being held at Caesar's official residence, and hosted by his wife Pompeia and his mother Aurelia. Clodius dressed himself up as a woman and stole into the house, allegedly to, let's say, entice Pompeia. But he was caught by a maid who heard him speak, obviously with a male voice, and raised the alarm. Now, this was absolutely scandalous to the Romans. Not only had a man infiltrated this most sacred of occasions, but had done so in order to sleep with a married woman. A married woman, moreover, who was the wife of the chief priest himself. Caesar, if you're wondering, divorced Pompeia on the spot, not because he accused her of any infidelity, but because, as the saying goes, Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. So Rome was engulfed in a scandal, and Clodius was put on trial for sacrilege. When it came to his evidence, he claimed that he'd in fact been miles away, miles from Rome, so it really couldn't have been him, that old chestnut. But in fact, on the night of the desecration, he had visited his friend Cicero in his house on the Palatine in Rome. This put Cicero in the unenviable position of having to testify against his friend. Well, Clodius's acquittal was bought in the end by Crassus, who bribed the jury. Interestingly, Caesar, whose wife it had been that Clodius had tried to seduce, did not seem to harbour any anger towards him. In fact, Clodius and the triumvirate struck a deal whereby Clodius, by being adopted by a patrician family, would become a tribune of the plebs, which was a separate branch of the Roman legislature, and would help the triumvirate pass their bills. This arrangement would prove to be disastrous for Cicero. Clodius had been incensed by what he saw as the betrayal of a dear friend, and once he'd been elected to the tribunate, he wasted no time in rallying a mob of thugs to his side. And as well as various laws which would give much needed relief to the poor, Clodius proposed a law to exile individuals who had put Roman citizens to death without trial. He was talking about Cicero. Cicero, who was being harassed by Clodius's mob, donned mourning garb and let his hair and beard grow out. He appealed to Pompey for help, but none was forthcoming. He even appealed to Caesar, but nothing there either. It does seem that the two men were uneasy about the treatment of Cicero by Clodius and his mob, but precisely because of the mob, they were unwilling to risk their own positions to help that of their rival, Cicero having made clear he thought the actions of the triumvirate were quite unconstitutional. When Clodius introduced a law which would have made it a capital offence to offer him shelter, Cicero felt he had no choice but to flee the city into exile. It was possibly the worst period of his life, and he gave himself up to despair for a long time. For around a year he wandered from place to place in a deep depression. His gifts of eloquence and rhetoric, gifts he prized as highly as he prized the Roman constitution, proved useless against the brute force and manipulation of the demagogue. Even as he sought shelter with friends, there were some who turned him away, not wanting to risk their neck. All the while in Rome, Clodius was still causing trouble with his mob. They had destroyed Cicero's house and attacked many of his supporters. But people were also beginning to lobby for Cicero's return. His wife Terentia, his friend Atticus, and Pompey most notably. By this time Clodius had turned on his maker and was openly hostile to Pompey. And so August 57 BC saw Cicero returning to Italy, and by all accounts he was given a hero's welcome. The Senate had overturned his exile, and Cicero was even awarded damages to repair his ruined properties. Apparently, even his old enemy Crassus was pleased to see him. Clodius was still kicking about with his mob, but Pompey had a tamed tribune named Milo. In truth, Milo's methods weren't 100 miles away from those of Clodius. He also had a mob he could call upon to cause trouble, and this is exactly what he did. Eventually, Milo's gladiators killed Clodius in 52 BC, and when it came to court, he was defended, unsuccessfully, by Cicero. By 51 BC, tensions were brewing between Caesar and Pompey. The third triumvir, Crassus, had been killed by the Parthians whilst on campaign in the east. This had the result of putting the remaining two men in direct competition with each other. both had very loyal armies at their command. It's important to remember that Roman soldiers tended to be much more loyal to their commanding officer than to the Republic. It put poor Cicero in yet another quandary. He had spent the past few years, since his return from exile, mainly writing and generally keeping a low profile politically. You see, he had got himself into a bit of hot water when he unsuccessfully challenged Caesar on a bill he'd tried to pass, and had then essentially had to backpedal and offer Caesar his full public support. Now that his reluctant ally Pompey was at odds with Caesar, the day would soon come where Cicero had to pick a side. But in 51 BC, he was actually appointed governor of Cilicia, which was experiencing quite a tense period due to the imminent possibility of a Parthian invasion. But, much like in Sicily all those years before, Cicero governed efficiently and fairly and became very popular with the locals. At the beginning of 49 BC, Caesar, at the head of an invading army, crossed the Rubicon into Italy. Civil war had been declared. At first, Cicero did his best to stay neutral, but in the end decided to make his way to Pompey's camp. But when Caesar's forces trounced Pompey at Pharsalus in Greece, he accepted Caesar's pardon and returned to Rome. It was around this time that Cicero married again. Though he and Terentia had been, it seems, quite happily married for the better part of 3 decades, they had grown apart and eventually divorced around the time of Cicero's governorship of Cilicia. Cicero's new wife was Publilia, and she was much younger than he was. It was posited by Tiro, Cicero's slave and later freedman, that Cicero married Publilia for her money, as he was in a bit of financial difficulty, having had to pay back Terentia's dowry. Speaking of Tiro, this was also the period where Cicero wrote some of his most influential texts on oratory and rhetoric. Now, Tiro was Cicero's secretary, and that meant he would take down Cicero's words as quickly as he could speak them. He was able to take down verbatim records of speeches. How he did this was by use of a shorthand system of his own invention, some of which, believe it or not, is still in use today. I.e. or id est, meaning that is, e.g. or exempli gratia, meaning literally for sake of example, etc. or etc., meaning and the others, and so on and so on. So many of these Latin abbreviations, which we use on a day-to-day basis, as well as the ampersand, are all thought to have been invented by Tiro. In fact, you could quite plausibly argue that this former slave has had more of a practical impact on language than Caesar, Crassus, Cicero, or any of the others. Cicero's marriage to Publilia was short and unhappy, and not long after, in 45 BC, his favourite child, his daughter Tullia, died in childbirth. Cicero was inconsolable for a long time, shunning company and writing philosophically about his grief. It's possibly because of this isolation that he wasn't invited to take part in the assassination of Caesar on the Ides of March. By that time, Caesar had been declared dictator in perpetuity. At any rate, Cicero was delighted at the death of the tyrant and was greatly optimistic that his beloved republic would be restored. It didn't last. In the chaos that erupted after Caesar's death, Antony and Cicero were essentially left in charge. Cicero negotiated a deal whereby the Senate would legitimize the positions of the Caesarians, who, of course, had been assigned their posts without senatorial procedure being followed, and in exchange for that, the assassins of Caesar would be pardoned. This was agreed by both parties, including Antony. However, Antony soon jettisoned all pretense of compromise. While giving Caesar's eulogy, he riled the crowd into such a frenzy of fury that nearby buildings as well as homes of senators were targeted. And despite Caesar's will naming his great-nephew Octavian his heir, Antony took this role on for himself. Antony was predisposed to hate Cicero. He was the adopted son of Lentulus Sura, whom you'll remember Cicero had executed. But more than anything, the two men represented the qualities that the other hated the most. To Cicero, Antony was a violent, corrupt thug with no proper learning, and to Antony, Cicero was a soft, cowardly weakling, unmanly in short. Cicero was particularly angry about the way Antony had taken control of Caesar's legacy, and so he attacked him in a series of speeches which he called the Philippics. O abominable profligacy of the man! O how intolerable is his impudence, his debauchery, and his lust! I'll leave you to imagine how well these Philippics went down with Antony. Once Octavian, Caesar's heir, arrived in Rome, he and Cicero struck up a close friendship. They shared a love of philosophy, and Cicero became a sort of mentor to the younger man. Cicero wanted to pit Octavian against his enemy Antony and have him side with the Liberatores, as Caesar's assassins were known. And at first it worked. Antony was declared an enemy of the state after being driven from the city. Octavian, a cunning operator even just aged 18, got Cicero to praise him to the Senate and to award him the entourage of a praetor, despite him, of course, not being a senator. And when Antony was defeated in battle, Octavian took control of the victorious army. And, not wanting to give this army up, he implored Cicero to run for consulship with him and to campaign on his behalf. You see, by attaching himself to the celebrated and influential Cicero, this unknown boy would have a much better job at landing the consulship. But, having used Cicero to achieve his ends, Octavian threw in his lot with Antony after all. He, Antony, and Caesar's former master of horse, Lepidus, became what would be known as the Second Triumvirate. They agreed to share the rulership of Rome and quickly set about compiling a list of their enemies and likely rivals. Some 2,000 were to be prescribed in all, meaning that a list of their names would be put up in Rome and a large reward would be given to the person who brought back the head of someone on the list, a death sentence. While drawing up the list, the three triumvirs met far from where their armies were camped, in secret, and deliberated on whom they wanted added to the list. They decided that to cement their new alliance, each would have to sacrifice someone close to them. Antony gave up his uncle Lucius, Lepidus his own brother Porus, and Octavian, at Antony's insistence, conceded Cicero. It's said that even the promise of 3,500 drachmae wasn't enough for many to turn him in. Such was the love and respect many Romans had for their pater patriae. But he was eventually caught by triumvirate forces, and instead of trying to escape, Cicero instead presented his neck and told the soldier to make a clean job of it. After the execution had been performed, the soldiers cut off his head and his hands, and Antony had them nailed to the rostra back in Rome. I'll finish the way Plutarch finished. by describing a scene which took place many years later. Lepidus had been killed, Antony had been defeated, and the second triumvirate was broken. Octavian was now Augustus, and the Emperor of Rome, no more Republic. One day he found one of his grandsons reading a book by Cicero. Thinking he'd been caught reading the work of a traitor, the lad tried to hide the book when Augustus, Octavian, took it from him and told him that Cicero had been a patriot and a great scholar. We can infer, surely, that the great Augustus lived to regret the way he'd used and dropped the great Cicero. Hi everyone, hope you enjoyed that. I just thought I'd jump on at the end and say a couple of things about sources. So, with regards to sources, the two primary sources connected to the Catiline conspiracy come from Cicero himself, obviously, his speeches, letters he sent at the time, and also the historian Sallust I mentioned. Now, obviously Cicero was far from impartial, but Sallust was actually a good friend of Caesar's, and we know that Caesar might well have been involved in the conspiracy himself. So it's very much important to note that both those sources are not exactly impartial. That being said, you'd be hard-pressed to find a single good word to read about Catiline. He does not seem to have been a very nice man. I also wanted to mention that it's always difficult to know how much detail to go into. In a video like this, I had originally planned for it to be about 15 minutes long, and clearly that didn't happen. But, you quickly realise when you're telling the story of Cicero, you kind of have to tell the story about the fall of Rome, and then you have to tell the story about Pompey, Caesar, Crassus, Cato, all these very, very famous people. So I hope I've managed to strike a balance between giving enough detail and not, sort of cramming in too much. If you do want to read more into the topic, I've left a few links in the description. Obviously, Cicero's letters, speeches, as well as just about any text from the ancient world you can find online. One of the good things about ancient history, it's out of copyright. You're not going to get the Pompey estate after you. I've also left a few links to videos by a YouTube channel, oh crikey, what are they called? Historia Civilis. I've just